A cold night and a warm heart. The neon sign outside Maggie's diner flickered against the midnight sky, casting a weak pinkish glow over the near-empty parking lot. It wasn't much, just a little roadside stop on Route 84, somewhere between Columbus, Georgia, and the rest of nowhere. A place where truckers came for coffee, tired travelers grabbed a bite, and the jukebox still played old country songs from a past no one really remembered. For Maggie Lawson, 45, this place was her life. She'd been working here since she was 20, long enough to know every creak of the floorboards, every regular's order before they even sat down. Her uniform, ***, a faded blue dress and a white apron, ***, felt more like a second skin now, just like the smell of fried bacon and the hum of the kitchen grill. It was a simple life, but it was hers. It was past 11 p.m. now, and the diner had mostly emptied. A couple of long-haul truckers sat at the counter, their boots tapping against the footrests as they nursed their coffee. In the corner, old Mr. Higgins, who had been coming here for 20 years, stirred his chili with slow, deliberate motions like he had all the time in the world. And then she saw him. A shadow lingered just outside the window, standing beneath the flickering glow of the street lamp. He wasn't new. She had seen him before, not often, but enough to remember. A tall, thin man in a tattered army jacket, his shoulders hunched, his face lined with years of struggle. His hands, rough and scarred, shook slightly as he counted the crumpled bills in his palm. He was always just there, lingering. Some nights, he stood by the entrance long enough for the cold to seep through his clothes, then walked away without stepping inside. Other nights, he made it to the door, looked in, then left like he had lost the nerve. Tonight, something was different. The wind howled through the parking lot, rustling his thin coat. The temperature had dropped, too cold for anyone to be out here without shelter. Maggie sighed, wiped her hands on her apron, and walked toward the door. The moment she stepped outside, the icy air bit through her uniform. She hugged herself, then looked at him. "You coming in, or you just gonna let all the heat out?" she asked, her voice light but firm. The man hesitated. His weary blue eyes met hers for just a second before shifting away. He cleared his throat, his voice hoarse, rough, like an old engine that hadn't been started in years. "I was just looking." "You can look just fine from inside," she said, motioning toward the door. He hesitated again, glancing toward the truckers at the counter, then back at the open road behind him like he was considering walking away. Maggie didn't give him the chance. She stepped past him, pushed open the door, and held it there. "Go on," she said. "Ain't nobody gonna bite." He exhaled, the breath visible in the cold air, then finally, with slow, stiff movements, shuffled inside. The bell jingled, announcing his entrance, and the truckers turned briefly before going back to their coffee. Maggie grabbed a menu and led him to a booth by the window. He moved carefully, lowering himself into the seat like a man who had spent too many years walking too far, carrying too much. He ran a hand over the table, staring at it for a moment before reaching for the menu. His fingers hovered over the cheapest item, the cup of soup and a half sandwich combo. She could see it already. The silent calculation in his mind, deciding how much he could spend versus how much he needed. He started, clearing his throat. "I'll just take the soup, potato, if you got it." Maggie didn't move. Instead, she leaned against the counter, arms crossed. "How about the sandwich too?" He let out a dry chuckle, shaking his head. "Soup's fine." "Yeah, well," she shrugged. "Slow night. Kitchen's got to stay busy, or they'll start bothering me." It was a lie. But before he could argue, she turned toward the kitchen window. "Hey, Lou, bowl of potato soup and a turkey sandwich. Extra mustard." Lou, the gruff but kind-hearted cook who had been flipping burgers here longer than Maggie had worked here, glanced up. His eyes flicked toward the man, then back at her. Without a word, he nodded and got to work. The man shifted in his seat, His hands folded and unfolded on the tabletop. "I'll pay you back," he said quietly. Maggie waved him off. "Don't worry about it." "No, really." His voice was stronger this time. "Someday." She just smiled. "Eat while it's hot." And just like that, a single act of kindness set something in motion, something that neither of them saw coming. More than just a meal. Maggie watched him as he sat in the booth, his shoulders slightly hunched, his fingers tapping against the table in an unconscious rhythm. He was uncomfortable, like he wasn't used to being in a place like this, like he had forgotten what it was like to sit somewhere warm, where people didn't look at him like he was something to be avoided. She had seen plenty of drifters pass through these doors over the years, but there was something different about him. He wasn't just lost in the world, he was lost in himself. Lou slid the plate onto the counter, giving Maggie a silent look before nodding toward the man. She understood what he was saying without words. He wasn't judging, but he had questions, the same ones she had. Who was this man? What was his story? But Maggie had learned a long time ago that some people didn't want to talk about their past, and she wasn't about to pry. She grabbed the plate and walked it over to the booth, setting it down in front of him. He hesitated for a second before picking up the spoon, his fingers wrapping around it with a kind of reverence, like the warmth of the soup against his hand was something he hadn't felt in a long time. When he finally took a bite, something in his face changed. It wasn't just hunger. It was the way someone looks when they realize they've been missing something for far too long. Maddie slid into the seat across from him, resting her elbows on the table, watching as he ate with slow, deliberate bites. He chewed the sandwich carefully, savoring each mouthful. It was a small thing, really, just a meal. But to him, it was more. She could see it in the way he held himself, in the way he tried not to eat too fast, as if he was afraid it would disappear if he wasn't careful. "So," she finally said, breaking the silence, "you got a name." The man swallowed his bite, then cleared his throat. "Walter," he said, his voice still hoarse, still carrying the weight of something unspoken. "Well, Walter, you ever gonna tell me why you stand outside this place like a ghost before finally stepping inside?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. He let out a small, rough chuckle. "Didn't want to bother nobody," he muttered, looking down at his soup as he stirred it with his spoon. Maggie sighed, shaking her head. "You ain't bothering nobody," she said. "Ain't like we got a line out the door. Besides, it's cold as hell out there. You got a place to stay." Walter hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the table. He didn't look at her when he answered. "Here and there," he said vaguely. Maggie didn't press. She already knew the answer. She had seen enough people like him to know what that meant. It meant nowhere. It meant a park bench, an abandoned lot, maybe a shelter if he was lucky enough to find an open bed. She hated thinking about it. She hated that people like him had been forgotten, that the world had moved on and left them behind. "You from around here?" she asked instead. Walter shook his head. "Not anymore," he said, taking another slow bite. There was something in his voice, something heavy, something that said he used to be someone else, somewhere else. Maggie had heard that tone before. It was the sound of someone carrying more than just a lifetime of hard days. It was someone carrying ghosts. She let him eat in peace for a while, refilling the coffee cups at the counter, exchanging quiet words with Lou. The truckers eventually paid their bills and left, leaving the diner even quieter than before. Mr. Higgins finished his chili and gave her a nod as he walked out the door, just like he always did. When she returned to Walter's booth, she saw that he had finished his meal, his plate neatly arranged, his spoon resting perfectly in the bowl as if he didn't want to leave a mess behind. His hands rested on the table now, his fingers absent-mindedly tracing patterns on the worn surface. "I'll pay you back," he said again, his voice quieter this time. Maggie sighed, sliding into the booth across from him again. "Walter, it's a sandwich," she said, "not alone." But he shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Ain't about the food," he muttered. "It's about keeping my word." He looked up at her, and for the first time, she saw it, the pride, or what was left of it. He wasn't just some man on the street. He wasn't just another lost soul. He was someone who had once stood tall, someone who had once had a place in the world. He might have been down now, but he wasn't broken. Not completely. Maggie sighed, shaking her head. "All right," she said. "Someday." Walter nodded, like that was enough for now, then pushed himself up from the booth. His movements were stiff, like his body had forgotten what it was like to move without pain. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a few crumpled bills, and set them on the table. It wasn't enough to cover the meal, not even clothes, but she didn't say anything. She watched as he made his way toward the door, pausing for just a second before stepping outside. The cold wind rushed in as he left, making the diner feel just a little bit emptier than it had been a moment before. Maggie exhaled slowly, picking up the money from the table and tucking it into her apron pocket. She didn't know why, but something about Walter Gaines stuck with her. She didn't know that by the next morning she would understand why. She didn't know that this night, this small act of kindness, was going to change her life forever. The convoy that changed everything. Morning came too soon. The sun peeked over the horizon in muted streaks of orange and gold, stretching across the sky as the world slowly woke. Maggie had been up since before dawn, her usual routine pulling her from sleep before her alarm even had a chance to ring. She had always been that way, early to rise, first to start the coffee, first to unlock the doors of the diner. It was a life she had grown accustomed to, one that ran on routine and familiarity. She flipped the chairs down from the tables, wiped the countertops, and checked the coffee pots, making sure they were full before the morning rush began. It was quiet now, the stillness of early morning pressing against the walls of the little diner. Outside, the highway stretched empty, only the occasional car passing through. Her thoughts drifted back to Walter Gaines. She hadn't expected to think about him this much. He was just another man passing through, another stranger with a story she would never fully know. But something about him lingered. Maybe it was the way he hesitated before stepping inside, the way he had counted his money with quiet shame, the way he had said he would pay her back like it was more than just a meal he owed her. Maggie had seen plenty of lost souls come and go, but Walter was different. By noon, the diner was buzzing with the usual lunchtime crowd. Truckers, traveling salesmen, families passing through on their way to someplace else. The clatter of silverware and the hum of conversation filled the space, pushing away the quiet that had settled in the early hours. She was in the middle of refilling a coffee cup when she felt it. The vibration. It started subtly, a low hum beneath her feet. The salt shakers on the counter trembled. The liquid in a nearby glass rippled. Then came the sound. Engines. Not just one, not just two, but many. Maggie glanced up, frowning as the noise grew louder, closer. The customers noticed it too. Conversation stalled. Heads turned toward the diner windows. A few people even stood up, craning their necks toward the parking lot. Then, through the glass, she saw them. 4 military vehicles. Big, armored trucks, dark-tinted windows, government plates. Not the kind of vehicles that just casually rolled into a roadside diner. A hush fell over the diner as the convoy pulled into the lot. The engines rumbled to a stop. Maggie's stomach twisted. This wasn't a coincidence. The doors to the trucks opened, and men stepped out. Not just soldiers, officers. Some were dressed in standard fatigues, but others wore decorated uniforms, the kind that only came with high-ranking status. The diner, which had been filled with the usual noises of clinking dishes and low chatter, was now eerily silent. Maggie watched as one of the officers, a tall man with sharp features and graying hair, adjusted his cap before striding toward the entrance. His movements were precise, practiced, the kind of steps taken by someone used to delivering serious news. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Maggie set the coffee pot down, wiping her hands on her apron as she met his gaze. He walked toward her with the quiet confidence of authority. The entire diner was watching. Forks were frozen midair. Coffee cups were gripped tighter. Even Lou, who barely looked up from his grill most days, was staring. The officer stopped in front of her. "Maggie Lawson?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. Her mouth felt dry. She didn't like the way her name sounded coming from him. "That's me," she said, crossing her arms. The officer removed his cap, exhaling slightly before speaking again. "Yesterday," he began, "you fed a man named Walter Gaines." Maggie's stomach dropped. Something about the way he said it. Asterisk, asterisk, the weight in his tone. The way the other officers behind him stood at attention. Asterisk, asterisk, made her breath hitch. She nodded slowly. "Yeah, I did." The officer exchanged glances with the other men before looking back at her. "You didn't know his story," he continued, "but we do." Maggie felt the tension in the room thicken. Even the customers were holding their breath. She swallowed, steadying herself. "All right," she said, keeping her voice even. "You mind telling me what's going on?" The officer gestured toward a nearby booth. "I think you might want to sit down for this." Maggie didn't sit. Something about the way he was looking at her made her stomach twist. She had spent years reading people. Truckers who had spent too long on the road. Teenagers trying to act older than they were. Traveling salesmen with fake smiles. But this man was hard to read. "I'm fine standing," she said. The officer studied her for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Walter Gaines isn't just another veteran," he said. "He's a decorated war hero." Maggie blinked. She had figured he had been in the military, sure. But a hero. The officer continued, his voice steady. "Walter served in Vietnam. Special Forces. His unit was ambushed in 1971 during a classified operation. He was the only survivor. Held off an entire enemy advance long enough for an evacuation team to pull out the wounded. He saved more than a dozen lives that day." Maggie felt a chill run down her spine. That tired, hunched-over man, who had counted his crumpled bills before walking into the diner, was the same person he was talking about. He was awarded the Silver Star, the Bronze Star, and 2 Purple Hearts for his service, the officer continued. But when he came home, things weren't easy. Vietnam veterans weren't welcomed back with open arms. He struggled, never talked about what happened over there. Eventually, he disappeared from our records. Maggie's fingers tightened around the edge of the counter. "How long has he been living like this?" she asked. The officer's jaw tightened. "Decades. He worked when he could, lived where he could, never asked for help. Most people forgot his name." His eyes met hers. "But you didn't." Maggie shifted, feeling something unfamiliar settle in her chest. She had only met Walter for one meal, one conversation, and now she was standing in the middle of something much bigger than herself. She glanced past the officer toward the trucks outside. Whatever this was, it wasn't just a casual inquiry. She exhaled. "So why are you here now?" The officer hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because last night," he said, "after he left your diner, Walter Gaines found a payphone." Maggie felt her breath catch. "He made a call," the officer continued, "a number he hadn't dialed in over 30 years. Maggie's pulse picked up. The officer straightened. "He said he was ready to come home." The words settled heavy in the air, pressing against her chest. Walter hadn't just been passing through. He had made a decision, maybe the hardest one of his life. And now, standing in the middle of her tiny diner, surrounded by a room full of silent onlookers, Maggie realized something. This wasn't just Walter's story anymore. It was hers too. A promise and a past unraveled. Maggie stood frozen, her mind racing as she processed the words. He said he was ready to come home. The sentence replayed over and over, its weight settling in her chest like a stone. Walter had spent decades slipping through the cracks, surviving in the shadows of a world that had forgotten him. And now, just hours after sitting in her booth and eating a simple meal, he had decided to stop running. She exhaled, her arms still crossed as she stared at the officer. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that after one meal in my diner, Walter Gaines decided to stop being a ghost." The officer nodded. "It may not seem like much, but sometimes the smallest kindness is what finally reaches someone." Maggie frowned, rubbing her temple. "All right," she said, her voice laced with skepticism. "So what happens now?" The officer shifted slightly, glancing at his men before looking back at her. "That's partly up to you." Maggie's eyebrows lifted. "Me?" "Walter asked to see you," the officer said. "Before anything else, before he gets help, before he starts over, he asked for you." Maggie felt something tighten in her throat. She barely knew the man. One meal, one conversation. That was it. And yet, she was the one he had reached for when he finally decided to turn his life around. She had spent years serving strangers, pouring coffee, hearing stories she forgot as soon as they were told, but Walter wasn't someone she could just forget. She glanced toward the window, the military trucks still sitting in the parking lot like silent witnesses to the moment unfolding. This wasn't just a routine visit. This was something else. She took a deep breath. "Where is he?" The officer motioned toward the door. "He's waiting outside." Maggie hesitated, her fingers twitching slightly against the edge of the counter. She had no idea what she was about to walk into, no idea why this man had attached himself to her kindness in such a profound way. But deep down, she knew one thing. She wasn't about to turn her back on him now. Without another word, she nodded and stepped around the counter. The officer turned and led the way, his boots clicking against the floor as the entire diner watched them move. As Maggie reached the door, she could feel the weight of a dozen curious eyes pressing against her back, but she ignored them. This wasn't about them. The moment she stepped outside, the sharp bite of the cold air hit her skin, stealing her breath for just a second. She barely noticed it. Her eyes were already on him. Walter sat on the edge of the nearest truck's open tailgate, his body wrapped in a heavy wool military-issued blanket. Up close, he looked even older, the deep lines in his face, etched by a life lived in survival mode. His hands, resting in his lap, were still calloused and scarred. But now, they were steady. The moment he saw her, he straightened slightly, a small, almost uncertain smile flickering across his face. Maggie crossed her arms, cocking her head slightly. "Didn't think I'd be seeing you again this soon." Walter let out a dry chuckle. "Didn't think I'd be seen at all." She glanced at the uniformed men standing nearby, then back at him. "So what's all this about?" Walter exhaled, his hands clasping together. "I made a call," he said, his voice softer now, like he was still trying to believe it himself. "Told them I was ready." "Ready for what?" she asked. Walter's gaze dropped for a moment before he looked back up at her. "To stop running." Maggie's throat tightened. The words were simple, but the meaning behind them was huge. This wasn't just about getting help. This was about decades of isolation, decades of believing he didn't deserve help. She swallowed hard. "That's a big step, Walter." He nodded slowly. "Reckon it is." Silence settled between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Maggie had always been good at reading people, and in that moment, she understood something without him even saying it. Walter wasn't just asking for a place to sleep or a hot meal. He was asking for a chance. A real one. She sighed, shifting on her feet. "What happens now?" One of the officers stepped forward. "We're taking Walter to a veterans housing program. He'll have a place to stay, medical care, and access to services to help him transition back into stable living." Maggie looked at Walter. "That what you want?" He nodded. "Yeah." She studied his face for a long moment before speaking again. "So why ask for me?" Walter hesitated, his fingers tightening slightly around the edge of the blanket draped over his shoulders. Finally, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something small, an old folded envelope. The edges were yellowed, worn from years of being carried, but never opened. He held it out to her. Maggie frowned, taking it carefully. What is this? Walter's throat bobbed, his voice just above a whisper. A letter I wrote a long time ago. Never sent it. Maggie looked down at the envelope, her fingers tracing the faded ink of his name. To who? Walter's gaze drifted toward the horizon. My daughter. Maggie's breath hitched. Your daughter. He nodded. Haven't seen her since she was a baby. Left before I ever got to hold her. Been too much of a coward to find out if she even wanted to know me. His voice wavered slightly, but he steadied himself. But if I'm gonna do this, really do this, I need to stop pretending like none of it matters. Maggie stared at him. This wasn't what she expected. She had thought maybe he wanted to thank her, maybe say goodbye before leaving. She hadn't expected him to hand her a piece of his past. She swallowed, her fingers tightening around the letter. You want me to find her? Walter's lips pressed together before he nodded. If you believe in second chances, I figured maybe you'd help me send it now. Maggie let out a slow breath. She looked down at the envelope, at the weight of 5 decades tucked inside it. She wasn't a detective. She wasn't some grand messenger of fate. She was just a waitress in a roadside diner. But sometimes that was enough. She lifted her eyes to his. What's her name? Walter swallowed hard. Angela Porter. Maggie absorbed the name, the syllables rolling through her mind as she committed them to memory. A long silence stretched between them before she finally gave a small nod. All right, Walter. His breath hitched slightly, like he hadn't dared to believe she'd say yes. You'd do that. She tucked the letter into the pocket of her apron. Yeah, I'll find her. Walter's eyes softened, his lips pressing together. Thank you, Miss Lawson. She just nodded, because she knew if she spoke, her voice might betray the lump in her throat. One of the officers stepped forward. It's time to go. Walter nodded, his body moving stiffly as he stood. But before he climbed into the truck, he turned back to Maggie one last time. If she don't want nothing to do with me, he said, voice barely above a whisper, don't let it weigh on you. Maggie let out a small, short laugh. Walter, I've had worse people yell at me before breakfast. A slow, grateful smile tugged at his lips. And then, just like that, he was gone. Maggie stood in the parking lot long after the trucks had disappeared down the highway. The letter in her pocket felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. She had no idea what Angela Porter would say when she found her, but she was damn sure going to try. Searching for a ghost from the past. The envelope sat on the dashboard of Maggie's old Ford pickup, the worn paper catching the glow of the early evening sun. The diner was closed for the night, the doors locked, the neon sign flickering dimly as the parking lot emptied. But Maggie wasn't heading home. She leaned back in the driver's seat, fingers drumming against the wheel as she stared at the name scrawled on the front of the letter. Angela Porter. She had never met this woman, had never even heard the name before today. But somehow, she had been entrusted with delivering the past. Walter was gone now, carried off in the back of a military truck, heading toward a future he had long thought impossible. But he had left something behind. A weight, a history, and a daughter who, for all she knew, had no idea that her father had been alive all these years. Maggie exhaled and grabbed her phone from the passenger seat. She wasn't exactly sure how to go about something like this. It wasn't as if she had experience finding lost relatives or delivering life-altering news to strangers. She opened the search bar, typing the name slowly. Angela Porter. Dozens of results popped up, too many to sift through without more details. She frowned, narrowing it down to Mobile, Alabama, the last place Walter had any connection to. The search refined. One name stood out. Angela Porter, 54 years old. Maggie hesitated, her thumb hovering over the screen. What if this wasn't her? What if she had the wrong person? What if Angela wanted nothing to do with this? She pushed the doubts aside and tapped on the number listed. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then a voice. Hello. It was a woman, her tone cautious. uncertain. Maggie licked her lips, suddenly hyper-aware of how crazy this was going to sound. Hi, is this Angela Porter? A pause. Who's asking? Maggie's grip tightened around the phone. My name's Maggie Lawson. She hesitated, realizing she had no simple way to say this. I met someone recently, a man named Walter Gaines. Silence. Maggie heard a sharp inhale on the other end of the line. Then the voice, softer this time. That's not possible. Maggie swallowed. Ma'am, I know this might be hard to hear, but Walter's alive. Another pause, this one longer. Maggie thought for a second that Angela had hung up. But then, a breathy, disbelieving whisper. My father's dead. No, Maggie said gently. He's not. Angela didn't speak. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, filled with 50 years of absence. Maggie knew she had to keep going. He's been living under the radar for a long time, she said. I don't think he ever knew how to come back. But last night after I met him, he decided he was ready to stop running. She reached for the envelope, running her fingers along its edges. He gave me something for you. A letter, one he wrote a long time ago. Angela exhaled sharply. A letter. Her voice was tight, like she was forcing the words out. Why now? After all this time? Maggie didn't have an answer to that. I don't know, she admitted. But he wanted you to have it. And if you're willing, I'd like to get it to you. Angela was quiet again. Then, finally, where are you? Maggie straightened. Bowling Green, Kentucky. Another long pause. I need a minute, Angela said. The line went dead. Maggie sighed, setting the phone down. That was it. No promises, no guarantees. Just a moment of truth and uncertainty. She ran a hand over her face, staring out at the darkening sky. This wasn't something she had planned for. She was just a waitress in a small-town diner, not a messenger of fate. But fate didn't seem to care. Now, all she could do was wait. 2 days later, Maggie was halfway through the dinner shift when the door to the diner opened, the little bell chiming as a woman stepped inside. She was in her early 50s, her hair pulled back into a neat ponytail, dressed in a simple navy blue jacket and jeans. She didn't look like she belonged in a roadside diner. There was something too composed, too careful about her. But what struck Maggie the most was her eyes. They were blue, just like Walter's. Angela Porter had arrived. Maggie wiped her hands on her apron, stepping out from behind the counter. Angela. The woman nodded, her lips pressed into a tight line. You Maggie. That's me. Angela hesitated, glancing around. The diner was quiet this time of night, only a few customers lingering in the booths. Finally, she exhaled. I wasn't sure I was going to come. Maggie nodded slowly. I get that. Angela looked down, her fingers fidgeting with the strap of her purse. I don't know what I expected, she admitted. I don't even know why I'm here. Maggie reached into her apron pocket, pulling out the worn envelope. Maybe you're here for this. Angela's breath caught as she stared at it. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers brushing against the paper like it might disappear if she wasn't careful. She swallowed, her throat working around emotions she wasn't ready to voice. He really wrote this, she whispered. Maggie nodded. A long time ago. He never sent it, but he wanted you to have it. Angela hesitated before taking the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. She stared at it for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then, finally, she exhaled. I don't know what's in here, she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know if I even want to read it. Maggie tilted her head. But you came all this way. Angela let out a weak chuckle. Yeah, I did. A moment of silence stretched between them before Angela shook her head, shoving the envelope into her purse. I should go. Maggie frowned. You just got here. Angela's lips pressed together. I don't. She hesitated, running a hand over her face. I don't know how to process this. Maggie nodded. That's fair. Angela looked at her, something conflicted and raw in her expression. What was he like? Maggie took a breath. Tired. Worn down. But there was something else too. She met Angela's gaze. He wanted to fix what he broke, even if it was 50 years too late. Angela swallowed hard. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then, without another word, Angela turned and walked out the door. Maggie stood there, watching her go, the unfinished story still lingering between them. Some things took time. Some wounds never fully healed. But maybe, just maybe, this was the first step towards something neither of them had expected. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. A letter, a decision, and a second chance. The diner was quiet again, the way it always was after the last wave of evening customers had come and gone. Maggie stood behind the counter, staring at the door where Angela Porter had just walked out, the bell's chimes still faintly ringing in her ears. She exhaled, running a tired hand through her hair, feeling the weight of everything settle in. Angela had left, the letter tucked away in her purse, unread. Maggie didn't blame her. It wasn't the kind of thing a person could just open and read like an old postcard. It was a piece of a past she had buried. She wanted to believe Angela would come back, that she'd read it, that she'd want to know the man who had given it to her. But Maggie also knew that some wounds were too deep, some ghosts too heavy to confront all at once. Still, she hoped. And in the meantime, life kept moving. The next morning, Maggie went about her routine, flipping chairs down, making sure the coffee was strong enough to wake the dead, wiping down the already clean counter just to keep herself busy. She had just started setting out silverware when the bell above the door jingled. Maggie looked up, expecting to see one of her regulars, maybe old Mr. Higgins with his usual bowl of chili, or one of the truckers looking for their morning caffeine fix. Instead, she froze. Angela Porter was standing in the doorway. But this time, something was different. Her posture wasn't as stiff, her eyes weren't as guarded. She clutched the envelope in one hand, but it was open now. Maggie swallowed, wiping her hands on her apron as Angela slowly made her way toward the counter. She looked exhausted, like she hadn't slept since their last conversation. When she reached the counter, she set the letter down in front of Maggie, smoothing out the creases with careful fingers. Maggie hesitated before speaking. "You read it." Angela let out a slow breath. "Yeah, I did." Maggie searched her face for something. Anger, sadness, regret. But there was only a kind of quiet weariness, like she had spent the entire night wrestling with something she wasn't sure she could win against. Angela tapped a finger against the letter, her voice softer now. "He wrote this when I was just a baby." She shook her head slightly, a half-laugh escaping her lips. "I barely remember him, you know. My mom never talked about him much. All I knew was that he left, that he wasn't someone worth waiting for." Maggie stayed silent, knowing Angela needed to say this in her own way, in her own time. Angela sighed, looking down at the letter again. "I don't know what I expected when I read it. Maybe another excuse, maybe something to justify why he disappeared. But it wasn't that." She traced the edge of the paper absently. "He talked about how scared he was," she continued. "Not of war, not of dying, but of coming home. He said he didn't know how to be a father, that he thought we'd be better off without him." Maggie's chest tightened. She had only known Walter for a few hours, but she had seen the weight he carried, the regret etched into his bones. Angela clenched her jaw, exhaling sharply. "For 50 years, I thought he didn't want me. And all this time, he was just lost." Maggie leaned forward slightly, resting her hands on the counter. "He never stopped thinking about you, Angela." Angela let out a weak laugh, shaking her head. "And what am I supposed to do with that? He's a stranger to me, Maggie. Just because he's my father doesn't mean I know how to fix this." Maggie tilted her head. "I don't think he's asking you to fix anything." Angela met her eyes, searching for something. Maybe a reason. Maybe an answer Maggie couldn't give. Maggie softened her voice. He just wanted you to have the choice. Whether you want to know him or not, that's up to you. But for the first time in his life, he finally stopped running. Angela's fingers curled around the letter. She was quiet for a long moment before finally nodding. I don't know if I can just forgive him, she admitted, but I think I need to see him. Just once. Maggie felt a small spark of relief. I think he'd like that. Angela swallowed hard, shoving the letter back into her purse. Where is he? Maggie wiped her hands on her apron. Veterans housing in Louisville. The officers who picked him up said he'd be getting medical help, a place to stay. Somewhere stable. Angela nodded, staring down at the countertop, thinking. Then, finally, she pushed herself up from the stool, adjusting the strap of her purse. I should get going. Maggie hesitated before speaking. Angela. She turned. Maggie gave her a small smile. He never thought he'd get a second chance, but he got one. And so do you. Angela studied her for a long moment before giving a small, hesitant nod. Then, without another word, she walked out the door. Maggie let out a slow breath, feeling a mix of exhaustion and something else. Hope. She didn't know how this story would end. Maybe Angela would see Walter, and it would be too late. Maybe the pain was too deep, the past too heavy. Or maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something new. 1 week later. The morning was slow, the diner quieter than usual. Maggie had just finished refilling the coffee pots when the door opened. She glanced up, then froze. Walter Gaines stood in the doorway. But this time, he wasn't alone. Angela stood beside him. Walter's frame was still thin, his face still lined with years of hardship, but there was something different about him now. He stood taller. His hands weren't shaking, and beside him, Angela wasn't as guarded as she had been before. Maggie set down the coffee pot, stepping forward. Well, she said, raising an eyebrow. Didn't think I'd be seeing both of you again. Walter let out a low chuckle, glancing at Angela. Didn't think I'd be seen at all. Angela sighed, shaking her head, but there was something softer in her expression now. She turned to Maggie. We had a lot to figure out, but I think we're going to try. Maggie's chest tightened in the best way possible. She nodded, smiling. That's all you can do. Walter looked at her, his weathered blue eyes holding something unspoken. Gratitude. Maggie, he said, his voice steady, clear. You saved my life. Maggie shook her head. No, Walter. You just needed someone to remind you it was worth saving. Walter gave a slow nod, his lips pressing together. Angela glanced at the menu on the wall. So, she said, smirking slightly, this famous turkey sandwich any good? Walter laughed. Maggie chuckled, motioning toward the booths. Why don't you two find out for yourselves? They sat together, father and daughter, 50 years of distance between them, but something new forming in its place. Maggie stepped back, watching them, knowing that whatever happened next was theirs to decide. Some stories didn't have perfect endings, but sometimes the smallest moments, ***, a meal, a conversation, a single act of kindness, ***, were enough to change everything. And maybe, just maybe, that was all that mattered.